Hello, Soundies. Welcome to our Sound for Video session. Great to have you all here today on the 19th of May, 2024. Did I get all that right? 2024. Okay, yes, good. I think we're in the right year and the right month. Let's go over to the agenda. Hope you're all doing great out there and making some great sound. We missed you last week, but it's great to be back. So, let's talk about today's agenda first. This is a workshop, of course, which goes along with our courses over at school.learnlightandsound.com. It's great to have you all here. I love the little community that is kind of built up around this, and I hope that you find the sessions useful. And they were originally set up as question and answer sessions for those that have enrolled in the courses, but we talk about general topics related to sound for video, so we'll keep on doing that. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about boom poles, and in particular, Ambient sent over in full disclosure, they sent this to me at no expense to me, one of their new QuickPole Slim Series 5 poles, the long pole, and so we'll take a close look at that, actually it's an initial look at that, along with several other boom poles that I have experience with, and kind of talk about the differences. And then we will go to the chat for questions and answers. We didn't have any submitted ahead of time, so we have a free-form agenda today. We can do what we want. So with that, let's go first to the overhead and talk about boom poles. So this is, I actually have a wireless setup here. Let me just show you here. I've got my DPA 4017B on the Rycote Nano Shield shock mount. And we have an audio limited / sound devices A10 transmitter here. And we are on the Ambient QuickPole Slim. And this is the long version. So before we get too much into, I don't want to focus on the microphone itself for now, but let's just go back to the agenda here. And let me just talk through a few things. I want to set some context here. First, isn't a boom pole just a stick with a screw at the end? And the answer is no, it's not quite that simple. And you'll see why as we kind of dive into some of the details. Being a boom operator is a very demanding job. If you are hand booming, if you have a boom that's static, it's on a stand of some sort, that's a lot more straightforward, and the demands of the pole are a lot lower then. In that case, could a stick with a screw at the end work? Probably so. But when you're hand booming, that's where the game really, really changes. And it's a much more demanding kind of experience for the pole itself and for the boom operator. So that's where having some of the nuanced, very thoughtful features that you get in the higher end boom poles become very, very useful. And so I want to clarify as well that we're going to talk about a whole range here. I've heard of people going to their hardware store and buying a painter's pole and making that do. And if you're on a really tight budget and you're just getting started, great. Good on you for saving money and for learning the nuances. But the people that do a lot of booming and are using painter's poles quickly learn there are some limitations to those painter's poles. And while they're very affordable, it's a tough job with those. They're a lot heavier. Their locks don't tend to be nearly as precise. You start to get rattling sometimes. A painter's pole was not made to be quiet, whereas a boom pole is made to be as silent as possible and not transfer any sort of handling on the pole itself up to the top of the pole and into the microphone. Obviously, there's shock mounts as well, but that's one of the things. So I want to be clear that the Ambient poles are not entry-level poles. These are poles that are designed for professional boom operators, and they are priced accordingly. They put a lot of thought into them. And if you're curious, Alan Williams over on Sound Speeds here on YouTube has actually done a couple of, I think he did a review of the QuickPole Slim. I think he was actually involved with the company on a sort of a consulting relationship in helping them kind of work through some of the details on the pole. So it's definitely worth checking out his full review if you're interested in the perspective of someone who is a full-time boom operator and what they demand of their pole. So could you just use a painter's pole from your hardware store? You could. You might be hurting by the end of the day, and you may have to do a number of retakes based on things that the pole does. All right, there are a lot of different materials that are used for boom poles. Aluminum is probably the most affordable. And aluminum is chosen from amongst the metals because aluminum is one of the lighter metals, although it can also be very strong. When you have it in a tubular form, it is quite strong. So it's quite stiff as well, although it does have a tendency to do some vibrating because of that, just the way that just the characteristics of the metal itself. In fact, I know back from my days when I did a lot of cycling, before carbon fiber, before most bikes were made out of carbon fiber, a lot of the higher end bikes were actually made out of aluminum. And what they had to do is they had to use carbon forks for the front tire, for the front wheel, because the aluminum was very, very, it would just vibrate. It was just so stiff it would vibrate. And putting the carbon forks on the front would give it would relax it a little bit and make it a much smoother, much more comfortable ride. So there are a lot of different characteristics of the different materials. There's carbon fiber, of course, and there are actually different types of carbon fiber, using different fiber content, using different ratios of fiber content. Originally, carbon fiber was generally made in layups done by hand, although I think I don't know a lot about carbon fiber production, but I think they've actually gotten to a point where they've automated some of that. The ambient poles are handmade in Germany. I don't know if that means, I don't know exactly what that means in terms of the carbon fiber, but they're using their own carbon fiber formulation. And what's nice about it is that it's very light. And we'll demonstrate here in just a minute how it does in terms of transferring, handling noise up to the microphone. And there's another common material that's used, and that is graphite. And let me just pull up an example of that. So up until this point, I have, my boom poles have been K-Tek boom poles, Avalon in particular. Could you go ahead and switch to the overhead there, Danny, please? All right, so here is a K-Tek pole. This is an Avalon Keg 100cc. This one is, you can see it looks a little bit different here. Graphite is the same thing that is used in pencils, but this is obviously a different formulation. They call it a graphite pole. It is lighter than aluminum. It has some of the characteristics of carbon fiber, but it's not quite as stiff as carbon fiber in my experience. So not quite as responsive. You'll get a little bit more of a relaxed feel to it than the ambient poles. The ambient poles are actually quite stiff and very responsive. And that's another thing that really kind of, it's a personal preference at some level, but of the boom poles that I've used, the ambients are definitely the most responsive and the stiffest. And in fact, if you extend their entire length and you put a boom mic at the end of them, what you'll notice is the graphite poles will have a natural bow to them. They'll look like they're sagging. That's just a kind of an example or an illustration of how they're a little bit different. Whereas the the carbon fiber ambient poles tend to be much stiffer, and they'll tend to be much straighter with much less bow to them. So that's another material that we've seen out there quite a bit. This one's a little bit more banged up. This is my small pole. This is made a little bit, this one is not as long and folds up much smaller. So it is a 5-section pole with 4 locks. So it gets much smaller. It's much easier to transport for smaller jobs. A lot of times I would use this for my corporate work when I was statically booming the pole. So I was just putting it on a stand and leaving it there all day. So that was pretty convenient that way. All right, so that's the different materials and kind of at a very high level some of their characteristics. There are also some other things. Internal cabling. Some have internal cabling, some do not. The ambient pole that they sent over does not have internal cabling, which is why you see I have it rigged up in a wireless format here. You can purchase the additional headpiece or tailpiece to internally cable it if you choose to do that. And there's a lot of considerations when it comes to internal cabling versus not. My K-Tek poles are both internally cabled. In fact, you can see here is the XLR output on the small one. This one would not be a great one for all-day booming because the tail, the XLR comes out at the bottom of the tail, so you can't set it down very easily without unplugging it. The larger pole that I typically use when I'm location sound booming has a different tailpiece. It has a side exit. You can see here. So this is a metal piece here at the bottom with a side exit XLR. And this one's a lot nicer because I can set that on the ground in between takes, or if I have to go put this at the cart, I have a little cup that it fits in. Although this is still not ideal because the cup is deeper than that. So what I need to do actually probably on that cup is cut out a section here so the cable can stick out. But that is a little bit nicer to work with than something like this where you have the XLR output on the tail piece there, straight out of the bottom. So those are some considerations as well. All right. So that's internal cabling. The other considerations with internal cabling versus not, some of the internal cable is straight cabling. So just literally an XLR cable that goes through the center of the pole. And then there's also coiled cable. And there are long debates about which is better and which people prefer. And the reality is that the problem with internal cabling is that if you do very quick cues, if you move the boom pole very quickly, there is a chance that that cable can hit against the inside of the pole and actually make some noise and then transfer to your microphone. And obviously you don't want that. There are some techniques that the different companies use. So they will sometimes put like a piece of felt over the cable, perpendicular to the cable, to help keep it from banging against the inside of the tubes. And then coiled cable, the same thing with coiled cable. It can still also, while it may not hit against the side as much, it still very much can. And they also have to use those techniques of using some sort of felt or something perpendicular to the cable to kind of cushion it from hitting against the side of the tubes. So there are personal preferences. Some people grew up or learned the craft of booming using exterior cables wrapped around the actual pole itself. And the challenge there is that you have to develop the techniques where when you do need to quickly extend the pole and you have the cable wrapped around the outside, you have to figure out how to let enough slack out to extend the pole, or inverse of that, if you need to pull the pole in very quickly. Being able to manage that very quickly is important too, at least when you're doing professional jobs where you need to be very, very quick about what you're doing. So that's an advantage potentially of internal cabling, is that you can do that much more quickly. The disadvantage is that you're kind of always having to be very careful about not having the interior cable hit against the inside of the tubes. So just some considerations there as well. Both of my K-Techs have internal cabling that is coiled cabling. And yes, if I cue very quickly, you can still hear it hitting against the pole. So I have to be kind of careful about that. So my personal preference on that was that I wanted the internal cable so I could extend or collapse the pole very quickly if I needed to. And I wasn't doing a lot of heavy cueing, like really fast, frenetic kind of cueing. So I didn't run into a lot of problems with the cable slapping around inside the poles. So it wasn't a huge, huge issue for me. Okay, that's everything we have there. Let's go ahead and now let me ask this question. Why does a Rode boom pole cost $100-ish and versus a Ambient pole? This one here happens to be close to $900 US. This is the Rode boom pole. This is the Ambient QuickPole Slim. This is the K-Tek graphite Avalon pole. So the pricing wise, the Ambient's the most expensive of these here. Then we have the K-Techs, and then we have the Rode. So let me just demonstrate. And actually, let me say one more thing before I demonstrate the differences. So if you are going to have a pole that's going to be on a stand all day long, the nuances of the Ambient are not going to be quite as important to you. Probably, under most circumstances. If you are professionally booming and you want to be a location sound mixer that does everything, including the booming, that's when moving up into a pole like the Ambient makes a lot more sense. So with that, let's talk about some of the nuances here. So first, setting that pole aside for the moment. Okay, so here's the Rode pole. And first of all, you'll notice that most of the non-professional poles will have foam at the bottom. That's pretty common. I think they're trying to help from a comfort standpoint. This pole does not come with any sort of internal cabling. However, it does have this channel you can unscrew this here, and you can route a cable through, although the pole is slim enough that you're going to, I don't think you could get an XLR connector through there, so you would have to solder it at the other end. You can see there is a slot. It looks like there's a slot here for the cable to exit. So you could put a straight cable through there and then solder on the ends yourself if you have a DIY spirit and the persistence to go learn how to do soldering and figure that out, which is not that big of a deal. All right, although be careful, don't do it in your kitchen. You need to have a well-ventilated area. So the locks, what some people call the knuckles, but the locks here look nice, but here's the trick I found with this road boom pole. If I loosen it and then I let it out and I tighten it, basically as much as it can go, it still slips. It can slip. And so that's one of the challenges I've had with this pole. Now, is it going to be a problem under most circumstances? Probably not, but that's the kind of thing where a professional is going to be like, I can't take that risk. I can't do that. I can't be the one that they have to redo a bunch of takes because my equipment wasn't working for me. So that's just one example there. Another one, obviously, it's larger diameter here. If you could take the foam off here, I think you'd see that this final tube here is larger diameter than the bottom tube here on the Ambient QuickPole Slim. I have found that foam is a little bit problematic. I found that it tends to, first of all, it slips. And when it does, it makes noise, and that transfers up through a very stiff aluminum pole up to the top. Now, if you're using a decent shock mount, hopefully that won't transfer through, but the less of that you can have going on, the better the chances of your mic not picking up handling noise. So that's another kind of potential downside I've found with these kind of boom poles. All right. This is a little thing, and this is where you're going to hear from maybe the most demanding people. I've heard Alan talk about this a few times before, but when you're working on professionally at the high end of the market, when you're working with gaffers and directors of photography on a TV series or a film, which is a relatively large budget piece, having a highly reflective top here, obviously the shock mount will cover that part, but then you have this highly reflective, in this case it looks like copper or brass, probably brass, definitely brass, that can actually reflect light. And so if you have especially a hard lighting situation and this picks up the light just wrong, it can mess with the lighting, and there's definitely gaffers and DPs are not going to be happy with you if that's happening. So that's another consideration on these less expensive poles. Whereas, let me pull out the K-Tek again. Here's the top of the K-Tek, which is a matte black right here, and likewise the Ambient pole. Again, backing this up, we're in a pretty tight space here. But yeah, here the top is also actually it's right here. This is the black right here. So it's much less reflective. In fact, I believe they used to put purple on the Ambient poles. That was kind of their trademark, but they have now moved to black so that it doesn't cast any light or reflect any light, I should say, and mess with the lighting design. Okay, so that's the lowest end of the market. Now, there are obviously some others. If you're going to get a budget pole, I would actually recommend the Deity pole. Let me pull that up. Okay, so here is the Deity pole. We actually talked about this on a live stream. I believe it was last summer. Actually, Alan Williams came on, and you can see they've done the same thing here. They put a little piece of foam here on the front. It is a carbon fiber pole. They have done a nice job. The foot here is pretty nice. You can pull that off. And then there's another little foot there that you can unscrew. And you can actually put a cable through there if you chose to. It does not come with an internal cable, but you could potentially do that. So that's the foot there. That's nice. You can set that down on the ground without... And that's the thing is, booming is a very physical job, and there are a lot of ways you can injure yourself. So it's really important to take care of yourself while you're doing it. Make sure that you're using great technique. And I'm not going to go into that here. I'm not necessarily an expert on that, but I do have the advantage of being quite tall, and so I very rarely have my hands well above my head for an entire take. I can usually get away with just having my hands down by my shoulders. So that's really good and helpful. Here, let's just back to the boom pole here. So the locks on these have kind of a weird clicking sound. I don't know if you heard that. Let's try that again. Definitely not as premium, and as soon as you loosen them, it's kind of just, it's pretty free. Whereas on the ambient pole, you'll notice here it's a much smoother experience. So if I loosen that here, it's like that. So that actually is pretty useful, because especially if you're trying to do this all with one hand, you don't want it to collapse on you and pinch your fingers. That happens quite a bit on the less expensive poles, but it's almost like there's a braking mechanism. It's really, really quite nice. And that's kind of an example of the nuance that I'm talking about, that you're going to get on these higher end poles. So for someone that's professional, working with their boom pole all day long, those kind of things, like not pinching your fingers, pretty important. If you're just going to put it on a stand all day long, something like this is probably definitely sufficient. Here's another example here. Less expensive pole. They use a sort of brushed nickel top, it looks like, which could reflect light. So again, if you're doing corporate video, most cases you're going to have it on a stand, and you're not necessarily going to need to worry about that. You can just kind of tune it, or you can put gaffer's tape over it if you need to, and you'll be just fine. Here, it didn't come internally cabled, but you see they do have the head here that allows you to run a cable through here, and then you would solder off the end. The DD pole is quite nice, though. If you're looking for something as a starter pole, you don't boom all the time, or you're often on a stand, this is a pretty good option. But those are, again, some of the nuances that... Can you hear that? Can you hear that click? Is that like...
Yeah, I can hear it.
There's this click every time you do that, which definitely is not ideal. But this one does seem to hold better than the road pole. So once I've locked those, they are very nicely locked. So I've been pretty impressed with the deity pole as far as budget poles are concerned. Also quite lightweight, and collapses quite small. So a little easier to travel with if you need to do that. So that is the deity pole. Now let's talk about the K-Tek poles versus the ambient poles. One of the things I mentioned before, and again, I don't have a lot of experience with the ambient pole yet, just arrived earlier this week. But I do have quite a bit of experience with the K-Tek poles, the graphite poles. I do find, in my experience, you have to be careful. Handling noise is another thing. So you have to be careful about that. See if I can get this up near the mic. Get a little bit less of that on the ambient, it seems.
How often are you grinding your hands into it?
You're not usually grinding your hands into it. Danny asked, how often are you grinding your hands like that? And the answer is you don't want to, but sometimes it happens.
Do people wear gloves?
And Danny asked, do people wear gloves? Depends on the person. There were some YouTubers that said you should be wearing white cotton gloves. I actually find those white cotton gloves create more noise than they prevent, has been my experience. So I do not wear gloves usually. If it's cold outside, obviously I will. I got a recommendation from Alan. He said that when he wears gloves, and I actually have a pair of these now, they're actually quite nice. Mechanics makes a glove, MECHANIX is, I believe, how they spell it, Mechanics. Very, very thin. So you still have the ability to change settings on things if you need to. They're nice and thin, but they keep your hands a little bit warmer than if you weren't wearing gloves out in the cold. But no, generally when I'm booming, I don't wear gloves. That's a personal preference. Maybe some other people have a different experience with that, but that's been my experience so far. The knuckles or the locks here, let me go ahead and take this little tie off here. just to prevent the cable. The most common question I've ever gotten on my YouTube channel is, what is this orange thing over your XLR connector? It's a piece of nylon mesh, and it just makes it so that when the cable swings freely, it provides a little bit of padding so that when the XLR hits the tubing, it won't damage it. It's nothing beyond that. The locks on this are pretty good. I do find you have to turn them a little bit farther to get them to unlock and then, back to locking. And it doesn't collapse quite as much, as freely as the Deity does, for example. So that's good. But I found these pretty good. And what I typically do, you'll see, is when I set these up, like during the day of the actual recording, I will extend them like this so that I have space in between them. So if I do have to grab the lower section to get a real good grip on it, I can do that. I also generally will extend the top section first and work down from there. Generally how I approach it. But overall, I think the K-Techs have been pretty good for me. I don't have any major complaints. They're a little, I think, weight-wise, they're pretty close to carbon fiber. I don't know. I've been pretty happy with it, but it does definitely have a different feel to it. Once you have a microphone out on the end of it and you're cueing it back and forth, there's definitely more sway to it. And that's maybe a good thing, maybe a bad thing, depending on how you do it and what you're doing. I think what I've always heard from Alan is that he really likes the stiff poles because he can cue very quickly if he needs to. He feels like he has a better, he can get a better recording because he can get cued in time better with the ambient poles, is my sense from him. So that's a thought there. Okay, time to take a time out and take a look at the chat. Danny's going to take a look at the chat for us here, see what we've got going there. Okay. First up, from Derek, we have a question. Cable or wireless, or cable with wireless on the grip end? Beautiful day here in Kingston, Ontario. Summer has finally arrived. It is warming up. That's wonderful. By the way, if you hear noise today, that's because there's a lot of wind whipping around this corner of the house here. All right, cabled or wireless? It depends. I think what you're seeing on the big sets now, the big budget sets, you're seeing more and more wireless now that digital wireless is producing the quality of sound that is demanded. There are a lot of challenges running long cables. And the way they typically have things set up on a large budget production is the boom operator is right there on set, whereas the production sound mixer is back in Video Village or some area near Video Village. And so they would have to run longer cables. They'd have to make sure that none of that ran near power cables or anything else, ballasts from lights, any sort of power adapters, any generators. And then you have to worry about people walking on them. You have to secure them, tape them down, so on and so forth. So it's a bit more work. Now that we have digital wireless systems like Shure Axient, sound devices, electrosonics, the quality of sound that we're getting is very good. And so a lot of boom operators are moving to wireless. Now, for corporate work, I would probably stick with cables unless you have a really good wireless system and someone dedicated to sound. Remember, every time you do wireless, there's a lot more work involved. You have to coordinate frequencies. You have to get the transmitter synced to the same frequency as the receiver. You need to have someone monitoring that full time. If you're getting any sort of weirdness, you need to address that. There's just a lot going on. With wireless, you're adding complexity for a big convenience of not having wires. So it's a huge trade-off. When you have a professional boom operator and production sound mixer, and often a utility sound technician as well, I think you're seeing a lot of them move to that. So to answer it for your situation, I would probably stick with wired unless you have a situation where running a cable is really onerous. There's a real problem with it in some fashion, and you have the budget to work with high-quality digital UHF wireless systems. So that's my take on it. Or if you're working on very low budget things and doing retakes isn't a problem, go for it. use the consumer wireless. Okay. Danny's bringing up the next question. My pole is clearly entry level Rode, but it always is on a C-stand. Basic is all I need. I'm no boom operator. Yeah, absolutely. I cut the cheap foam off my pole, to be clear. Yeah, that's a useful thing as well. And I think another thing that's very important too is even when you're up on a stand, thanks for that, Matt. Even when you're up on a stand, I do think it's still useful to have a shock mount. There are certain situations, locations where even the stand can be vibrating if there's something going on in that space. So I think it is still important to have a shock mount between the pole and your boom mic. So keep that in mind as well if you're getting transfer of low frequency rumble. Daniela, what about a tripod for lights where you can use the middle part or leg for microphone? You can do that, except the problem with most tripods is that they can't boom out and over. So if you're doing, if you're just capturing ambient sound, that's fine. If you're trying to actually boom over a person, then that becomes problematic. So unless you have a boom of some sort. Matt says, in Kenya, we broke a pole and had to use a cane fishing pole. Well, that's, you do what you have to do. Then that's when problem solving mode, absolutely. Go all in, figure it out, get the job done. Christopher says, Rode has a, quote, pro boom pole that's around $300 US, correct? I wonder how it compares to their basic pole. I believe I've never used that one, so I don't know, but I believe that's like a basic carbon fiber pole. I don't know if it's internally cabled or not, but I do vaguely remember when they released that some number of years ago. So Matt says, in a crunch, one time I used my iFootage monopod as a boom. Not recommended, but in a crunch, mounted, it works. Yes. This is one of those situations. I'm not here saying you need to spend $900 on a boom pole or you're just not cool enough. What I'm saying is that if you're booming a lot and you're doing it professionally, that's where you're like, you know what? That $900 is probably worth it because it will give me this, 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 and this, and I won't have a constant infection on my fingers because I have pinched them 700 times doing this full time. That's when it makes sense. And if you're just booming up on a stand all day long, then get what fits the budget.
She's asking if somebody tested that.
Did somebody test maybe using the Rolei? I don't know how you say that. Rolei tripod carbon 5CL. Maybe so. I don't know. See what people have to say in the chat. From iFootage, I have the Crane Extreme. Good. Okay. Excellent. Matt says, over to Tim, I clearly am an iFootage guy. I have over a dozen crab legs. They're so handy, several tripods, etc. Yeah, I have the iFootage. I have one of their very small, like basically tabletop tripods, but really beefy and big for cinema cameras. And that's been fantastic. And then also, I don't remember what it's called, but I think it's a Shark or something. I don't know. It's not the Shark. I don't know. It's a light stand, so it's a monopod light stand. So it has a base, a weighted base, and then a single carbon fiber monopod. It works nicely for that. It's a good example of how not to make locks. When you release it and bring it down, it's like, so it's really kind of rough, which kind of is like, hope this is not going to fall apart, but it's made out of good materials otherwise. Good stuff. I do like their locking systems. I think that's what Matt was talking about. Shoji Productions question, do you have any videos that show using a boom pole with a stationary stand for interviews? I don't know if I have a dedicated video on that, but let me go grab the important piece to make that work on a C-stand. 1 second. Okay, on a C-stand, of course, you have a grip head. And the grip head, of course, allows you to connect things. And this part, of course, connects to the C-stand itself. So that secures it to the C-stand. This is the grip head. And these are available, which are decent. These are very affordable, I think $25 or so at B&H. And what this allows you to do is you can rest the boom pole in here. So you put the front of the boom pole, the part that extends out here, and then latch the tail end under here. and that allows you to attach it. So you can, of course, just put this right here on the grip head. Like that. And you have a very secure connection. There are some others, slightly different designs. This is the least expensive design. There are a couple of different manufacturers that make this design. But that's what you can do to get it into a C-stand. So I haven't made a dedicated video about it, but that's how I typically do it. Bruce's Garage also has a solar operation. If I wanted to boom with a stand, what would you recommend? I would definitely recommend a C-stand of some sort with a grip head and a boom pole holder like that. If you're always doing it stationary, I would get the Deity boom pole. That would be my choice in 2024, based on the ones I've used so far. Okay, we're good there. All right, let's do a little demo here. Let me just secure this so that it doesn't swing around. You do have to be careful. Carbon fiber and graphite both are somewhat delicate. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and power up this transmitter on the mic on our boom pole here, and we'll boom it over Danny. And I'll do a little cueing back and forth so you can hear that as well. All right. So when we do this, there will potentially be a little bit of hissing interference. I'm working in a really tiny room, and this is pretty, even at low RF setting, this transmitter puts out quite a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and mute, power it on, and then I'm going to boom over Danny so she can talk for just a minute here. Oh, by the way, this is the long Slim. It's a pretty long pole. Even it only has 4 sections, so 3 locks. So it does not fold down or does not collapse as much as some of these other poles that we've shown. So that's kind of a trade-off, just so that you're aware. To achieve the slimmer pole, they had to put fewer sections, and fewer sections means you can't collapse it quite as far. So again, all sorts of engineering trade-offs whenever you're designing anything, and that also applies to boom poles here. But for me, I don't know. I'm excited to try it more. So here we go. I'm going to go ahead and mute first. I need to get some headphones for we're connecting to the Sound Devices 888.
Hi, everyone. This is Danny. It's been a few weeks. I've had various things going on. Other things going on. Yeah, as Curtis said, it's kind of windy outside today. We've got some storms moving in, and so last week it was pretty nice and sunny and warm, but this week it's going to be a little rainy. So for all of you folks where it's 80 degrees, enjoy your summer-like weather. But I'm sure we'll be getting it in a little while because it tends to heat up here pretty quick in the summer. That's all.
Okay, one other thing I did not talk about earlier is, and I want to show this really quickly, is this boom pole, the Ambient, has the best big chunky rubber foot on the bottom of any of the boom poles that I've ever used. And let me just show that to you really quickly here. Actually, let's go to the overhead camera. Okay, I'm hearing a little bit of buzzing. I'm getting some interference. So I think it usually interferes with that mic. I don't think the Earthworks is RF shielded, at least not a whole lot. So let's go ahead and switch over to the other microphone. Now I should be on. Can you hear me okay? Okay. All right. So a few things here. When I was cueing very aggressively, obviously what you were hearing there, I was hearing some noise and I thought, oh, is that handling noise? Is that my hands on the pole? And I think actually most of it, I'll have to go back and listen to it, but it sounded like most of it was actually the air moving past the microphone capsule. All I have on right now is just the foam cover. So that's what I think I was hearing there. I don't know what you heard what your experience was there in the chat if you want to share. But overall, in terms of handling noise, it seemed to do fine. In this case, again, using the Rycote Nano Shield shock mount. And that was the Sound Devices A10 transmitter into the A20 receiver and Sound Devices 888. The microphone, again, is the DPA 4017B. So little demo there. Okay, let's go back to the chat and see if we've got any questions in the chat. Danny's going to take a look for us here. We're going to set this down for now. Could use a little bit more gain in the boom with Danny. Yeah, I was actually setting it up for how I would typically do it in production, not for live, so apologies for that, Christopher. It's a good point. Linda heard nothing. Okay. Oh, wait. You didn't hear dialogue or you didn't hear handling noise? Hopefully no handling noise is what you meant by that. Do you still have the PTZ camera? No, I do not. I actually, the OBS bot sent over the camera, and I think they were still working out the software and the firmware. And I said, you know what? Why don't you take this back and let's get in touch again when you have finished your software. And I haven't heard back from them. So no, I don't have it was actually quite frustrating to work with, to be honest. And it also was not optical zoom. If I'm going to get a PTZ camera, if I'm going to invest, I'm going to get one with an optical zoom, it was doing digital zoom and it did not look good. All right, Linda, thank you for the clarification. No handling noise. Appreciate that. And yeah, that's the thing. That's one of the things that they aim for with those professional grade boom poles. Derek, could you maybe show us how you use the 888 to set the gain for the individual mic like you would in production? Yes. Can I do that right now? Do I have enough time to get it in the right spot? Maybe. Let's move this first. Sorry, just bumped the mic. Okay, so that's going to be on Danny. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to angle the microphone down towards you. Oh. So we can do this. I'm going to turn that on in a minute, but now I need to get the 888 into a spot where we can get it on camera so you can see. One second. Okay, let's switch to the overhead. All right, need to kind of position this a little bit. There we go. Camera's shaky, sorry about that. Just need to focus it. Okay, I think you can see that. Does that look okay? Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and first I'm going to go ahead and turn on the wireless transmitter. Okay. And Danny, you want to talk?
Test. In the corner. Ah, there it is. I think I can, well, I could hear it now. I took off my headphones so that I don't sound confused. As confused. Should I keep talking?
No. Okay, couple things. So I'm using the A10 transmitter. The A10 transmitter itself is where you set the gain. It's not until you move up to the next generation A20 where you have gain forward. If I were on an A20, I would set the gain here, but you'll notice here the gain is set to 0. So what I did is I set the gain on the transmitter itself. In this particular case, it's set to 49 dB with this particular microphone. So it's a condenser microphone, 49 decibels, and that puts us where we're starting. So as Danny talks...
Hi, this is Danny. I'm over in the corner watching you set this scenario up, and I'm still talking. Sorry, folks, I don't really know what to say.
So this is about... That's good right there, Danny. So what I'm doing here is I would trim it here. Actually, I could trim it with a gain, but then I use a fader to mix it. But I could, if, for example, it wasn't coming in quite hot enough, if it was a scripted piece and I knew that there wasn't going to be any laughing or potential things like that, I could gain higher. So I could have the peaks getting closer to minus 12 consistently, maybe even a touch above that. I do have a limiter here, and I do have a compressor if I wanted to use that, but I typically, for production sound, I will just turn on the limiter, but I will not engage the compressor. So that's typically how I would do it. Now, if it is if it's not a scripted piece, then I would probably leave more headroom. We can actually turn that off now. Let me go ahead and turn that off. Okay. Okay. So that's generally how I'd approach it. Oftentimes I'm leaving minus 18 dB of headroom on production sound things. As long as I'm getting a good signal to noise ratio, again, microphone positioning is a big part of that, especially if I know there's potential for a very dynamic performance, a very dynamic delivery of the lines. Definitely need to keep more headroom there. And especially if you're recording multiple people, that's where you also want more headroom, because in your mix, you don't want your mix is, if you have multiple people talking, especially if they're talking at the same time, remember those get combined in essence. And so you need to make sure that the mix is not also getting above 0 or up to 0 dB. So that's generally how I approach it. For live, this was a little too quiet for live. For live, usually you have to compress things more to get that presence and the loudness that you're aiming for. So for example, if we actually go back to the overhead again for a moment here, on my microphone, I'm actually using the compressor, and I've got that turned on here to get kind of, first of all, to even things out a little bit. You just saw I hit the limiter there. It flashes like loud. There it is. You can see it, we hit up against the limiter there, so it kept it from clipping. But I also have the compressor on, and I can show you that. One second here. Let me stand up so I can see it better from this angle. So I can come down here to the compressor. It's actually being applied pre-fader, and I can pop in there. I can change it to post-fader. If I wanted to do that, I don't need to do that. Here I have my threshold at minus 15, 3:1 ratio, a soft knee, so it's kind of a curved, more of a curved experience. Here's a hard knee, or actually I can change it to hard knee. There's a hard knee. There's a soft knee. You're not going to hear it a lot, but the soft knee will start to compress to make it more transparent, so I usually try to use that with dialogue. My attack's at 3 milliseconds, and my release is at 117 milliseconds. So pretty common settings I might use on dialogue. I might go with a longer release on dialogue. If you have someone that's a heavy breather, like myself. No, I mean, Danny gave me a funny look, but what I mean by that specifically is that some people's breaths are more prominent than others. It's picked up more prominently, so that can be really helpful. All right, we can pop back out of the compressor and back out to the main. Okay, cool.
Remind me next time.
Danny, just read the Curtis Judd taco. Just read the Curtis Judd taco recipe. Work for me.
Yeah, so when I'm struggling for things to say, just remind me.
That's what she can read next time. That makes sense. Good question. Any updates on Deity Theos wireless audio artifacts issue you mentioned a few weeks ago? No updates from my side. I don't know what. I don't know what Deity's doing with that, if anything. John says, I use the Rode Boom Pole Pro at the moment, which is okay, but I'm after a longer pole, preferably about 4 meters. What would you recommend? I don't hold a boom that often, so not mega money, please. Haha. The Deity pole is not a lot longer. In fact, I don't even know. Let's take a look and see what the Deity pole is. If I go to Deity mic and... where did they have the pole?
Oh, there it is.
There it is. 8.5 feet. So no, this is short. This is definitely a short pole. Sometimes you can find the K-Tek graphite poles, the Avalon poles on sale. I don't know, again, when you say not too expensive, I don't know exactly what you mean, but yeah, that's another thing. The less expensive poles generally are not quite as long. So I don't really have, I mean, the K-Tek poles, I got the K-Tek, the shorter K-Tek pole, which I use for travel. That one was on sale it was discounted quite a bit at Gotham Sound, actually. It was sort of an end of the year sale. And it was substantially less expensive. I think I spent $250 on it, but it's a shorter pole, so I don't know if I don't know. People in the chat, our lovely community, if you have recommendations, please share. But for longer poles, I don't know that I have any off the top of my head on the budget end. Okay. I would recommend the new K-Tek Avalon over the Deity pole. There you go. But they're substantially more expensive, to be fair, especially if you go for the longer poles. Derek says, thanks for the demo. Truly appreciate it. Starting to learn that with 2 or more mics in use and isolating each channel to set the gain, then back to mix during the recording takes. Yeah, you have to be careful. Sometimes when we just have a single mic, you're doing a sit-down talking head type of thing, we're used to pushing the gain a little bit more because we can get away with it. It's harder. It's definitely much more complex as soon as you have 2 or more. And you need to back off the gain usually a little bit. Oh, we're good in the chat? Okay. All right. What else did we miss here? What have we not covered? We do have a tutorial up on the main YouTube channel that went up this morning about how to set up to record directly into DaVinci Resolve. So if you have a microphone into an audio interface into your computer, how you set that up. It's a little bit different than other digital audio workstations, but we just quickly cover how to do that so that you have that knowledge both for mono mics and for stereo mics. So check that out if you haven't already, if that's of interest to you. We do have one. Can we talk about wild lines? Sure. We can always talk about wild lines. What's a wild line? First of all, let's define it. So when you, as a production sound mixer or a location sound mixer, you capture wild lines. Wild lines are dialogue that's captured on location or on the set, but not while camera's rolling. So the idea is that you can capture this, and it could be another option for the post-production team. Danny's laughing at something, I don't know what. But in any case, that's what the concept of a wild line is. And it's really a good idea to capture those on set if you need to. For example, if somebody in between takes, if there's going to be a voice off camera for the final piece, that's an obvious choice or obvious opportunity to capture a wild line. Sometimes you just want alternate performances. So if a director says, hey, that was a good take, let's go with it, and then they have the crew off setting up for the next set, and you're like, hey, would it be okay if I capture a couple of wild lines from the actor really quickly before they go do whatever they're going to do? That can be a good time to get them to do the same lines over again, to perform those lines over again and record those. So that's what the wild lines are. So can vary be very helpful for post. All right, Rory on a bike. John Roddy, you can save money by buying a pole that uses an ordinary straight cable. Also, VDB poles are good value for the money. Thank you so much, Rory, for sharing that. Appreciate that a lot. Nothing else going in the chat today? Nothing special? Oh, need a recommendation for a lav for less than $400 locking 3.5 millimeter. Deity W Lav Pro is worth looking at. Less than $400. I think that could get you into a Sanken COS 11D, and you can get that terminated in 3.5 millimeter. That's probably the toughest microphone. And while I don't always love the sound of that microphone directly into the recorder, it does EQ very nicely. So the Sanken COS 11D still, the only downside to that is that it does have a thicker cable than most others, which is a trade-off. Again, here's another example of a trade-off. Very durable microphones for lavaliers, but it's a little bit more tricky to hide that under a very form-fitting t-shirt, for example. So just something to keep in mind there. But my top choice would probably be the Sanken.
Okay, I don't know if this is for real or not.
Danny says she doesn't know if this next question is for real or not, but can you demonstrate how to split polywave files in DaVinci real quick? LOL. I use Wave Agent most of the time, but it's more work in post. Yes, here's the quickest demonstration I can give you. Go to my main channel, which is Curtis Judd at YouTube, and search for DaVinci Resolve Split Polywave. And we just released that video a few weeks ago, so it's covered all right there. In essence, you have to export. You have to import the audio into Fairlight, put all the different channels on different tracks, and then export the tracks. Christopher, how has the upgrade to the A20 receiver worked for you? It's been great. It's unfortunate that I fully invested in A10 transmitters, so the only one that I can get the gain forward feature on is the A20 Mini, which is kind of, again, not my main transmitter. It's more of a special purpose, hiding it on someone who's got a really challenging wardrobe. But otherwise, it's been fine. It's basically an A10 that in the future, when I get more A20 transmitters, will be really nice. And for those that don't understand the gain forward, the way that works is instead of trying to mess with 32-bit float, what gain forward does, or having to try to manage remote transmitters and change their settings remotely, what the gain forward does is it allows you to set the gain on the mixer itself, on the 888, for example. So what you're doing is you're capturing, and the same thing that Axient does with their digital wireless system, I believe, or a similar thing. What you do is that the transmitter is capturing the sound from the microphone at it's using a unity gain that's very low, transmitting that signal, and then you amplify it at the receiver. And so that makes it easier for you. You set the gain at the receiver. So that's a really fantastic feature. And that's one of the biggest challenges with, traditionally with wireless, is that the gain was on the transmitter and you couldn't necessarily get to it unless you were using a Zaxcom system who had a patented system where you could remotely change the gain on the transmitter. Now what Sound Devices has done and what Shure have done is that instead of amplifying at the transmitter, which incidentally potentially reduces the cost of it, although they're both very expensive transmitters, I don't know. It simplifies the transmitter potentially, but you're capturing at a much lower level at the transmitter, transmitting it, and then amplifying it from there. So, different approach. Actually, no, it probably doesn't make the transmitter any cheaper because they have to use a very clean preamplifier to pull that off. But in short, Christopher, yeah, A20 receivers are good. I mostly just wanted to take advantage of the offer they were making, which was really cool at the time. You could send in your A10 receivers and they would retrofit them to make them A20 receivers, which was amazing. So they're basically swapped out the electronics at a much lower price than buying an entirely new receiver. Love to see more of that from the manufacturers of the high-end gear. Okay, Danny says, I think we're at time here. All right, friends, it is time to get out there and make some great sound. Hope you have a great week. We will talk to you again next week. Take care.